So last week was this theme of audacious love, an awareness that we have a God of grace who so desperately loves us and thinks we are so precious and valuable he would send his son to die to guarantee our forgiveness. And we had these words from 1 John chapter 4. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. That we have a God who absolutely loves us. When we understand grace and this love of God, the plan of God is that love overflows from within us to one another. And there is this love from God and for each other that we share. And as that love grows, there's this sense of meaning and purpose in life as the gospel changes who we are, and that love flows through us to the world around us. Well, this week we pick up where that verse left off. That was verse 12. Here's chapter 4, verse 18. The theme today is don't be afraid. John writes, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears has not been made perfect in love. Then he goes on back to last week and says, we love because he first loved us. When I was a kid, I was asked to go swimming. I love the water, still do. Love to be in the water. If I'm at the beach or at a pool, I'm in the water. And there was this quarry. It was awesome. I'd never been there before, but there was this cool, 10 feet high rope swing. You could jump and sort of swing down to the water. And the cool thing is you could sort of get to the end and sort of let go and dive off the end. I never quite mastered the dive. I tended to sort of flop and fall. But in the middle of this quarry, there was this big dock. And you had to pass a swimming test to go out to the dock. Well, of course, I passed the swimming test. I go out to the dock, and it was awesome. In the middle of this little quarry, there's a diving board on the whole thing. And so I'm being, young kid, cool. And I dive off of the thing. And I realized something about quarries. First, the water's dark. And so as I dove in, I ended up underneath of the dock where there's no light. And I was disoriented. I had no idea where I was. And so I started swimming and realized I didn't know where up was. And one thing that sort of helped me understand was it started getting colder, and I realized I was going down instead of up. And in a panic as a little kid, I started swimming like a crazy kid. And I had that moment as I'm seeing the light at the top of thinking, I'm not going to make it. And I was petrified. I actually had nightmares about that moment for a while. See, I think we all have stories in our life, maybe from childhood, maybe recent, stories that make us afraid, stories that were moments in life that changed us, and fear entered our life, and we understood it. And some of those fears maybe still stick with you. So I wonder today, first of all, what's your story? Was there a time when you felt scared to death? So when Jesus says, and the Bible says over and over, don't be afraid, it seems kind of unrealistic to not be afraid. Because there are things in life that are scary. And our body reacts in fear. There's the fight or flight thing that kicks in, and danger happens, and fears happen in danger, so our body reacts so we can protect ourselves and stay alive. So fear isn't altogether bad, but our fears can also control us, and they can paralyze us. They can make the world small, and we can isolate ourselves from fear of things or people or ideas or thoughts. Because real hurt and damage can happen to us in our relationships if that fear finds its way to control our lives. And fear sort of seems to be a predominant story these days. Whenever you watch the news, you're supposed to watch this and be afraid, or listen to this person and be afraid. Everything seems to try to scare us these days. We're afraid for our health, afraid for our bank accounts, afraid for our children, afraid for the future. We fear other races and other countries. We fear anyone who's different than us. We fear anyone who disagrees with us. And after months of watching COVID reports, we're still watching them. And there's still a sense of fear about this virus and giving it to other people or getting it from other people. And there's this fear of this violence on the streets that seems to be a level of deep unrest as people are struggling and wrestling. And so we've been isolating and we've been hunkering down. So it's pretty cool to be out here. You at least get the worship in the parking lot this morning. And we have this sense, even as a church, of trying not to navigate worshiping together by fear, or starting school together by fear, but doing all the things we can to prepare to keep each other healthy, to keep our kids healthy. And we're trying to be wise and smart, not giving in to fear, but be intelligent, trying to keep each other healthy and keep each other safe. But there's this underlying fear about the whole thing. And so some of us are just rebelling against the whole thing. Rebelling against the fear, I'm just going to go and live and not be afraid anymore. And we're in this crazy time. And our fears are real to us. And they don't just go away, and they literally can paralyze us. All too often, I think, instead of facing our fears and examining our fears with the truth, that may be me. That's me. Sorry, John. We just plow ahead. Sorry, I kind of lost my place with the wind blowing here. That's me. Hey, John, I think this monitor behind me is so hot that it's picking that up, if that helps you know. Thanks for being patient with me. Sometimes I think when we don't address our fears, it comes out in some negative ways. We don't address it right away, so we stuff our emotions and we vent our frustrations and we dive into work or we veg out in front of a television set, all to sort of get away from the fear that finds its way to haunt us. If you remember back to the classic movie Jaws, they had made this mechanical shark, but it didn't work all the time, so they ended up filming a lot of the movie without you seeing the shark. And the truth was, it kind of made it more ominous and scary when you didn't see it. Once you could see the shark, it goes, oh, it sort of lessened some of that sense of ominous fear. I think the same thing happens with our own fears. When they're hidden and we don't identify them and understand what they are, those fears can haunt us and paralyze us and sort of stay submerged in our life. If we don't address them and talk about what's making me afraid and what's driving that, they find the way to stick around. Fears have a way of having power in our life when they're kept in the dark. So one of the great ways to battle fear is to look at it honestly and say, what's the truth about this fear? What's real about this fear? What can I do about it? I think, honestly, we live out of our fear much more than we want to admit most of the time. Things that we're afraid of happening. It causes us to make choices and decisions. It's the way we relate to each other sometimes out of fear. So Jesus tells this story. And in the gospel, it's a story about him walking to the disciples on the water. In John chapter 6, in Mark chapter 6. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him while he was in Bethsaida. And after leaving them, he went up to the mountainside to pray. And later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. And he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the water. And then these words, he was about to pass them by. But they saw him walking on the lake, and they got afraid. Now, I never thought that verse before. Jesus sees them on there. They're supposed to head across the lake to Bethsaida. He's walking across. He's about to pass them by in the boat and get there ahead of them, and they see him, and they're afraid. And that's a weird story to me, I think, of Jesus. Would you think of Jesus who sees somebody afraid, and he goes to them to rescue them? He sees these guys struggling all night trying to get across in the middle of the storm, and he's about to walk by. There's a moment, I think, when we're stuck in our fears, when we have a sense that God's just walking by. He's not stopping to notice. He's not coming to our rescue. We're in this fear, and where is God in the midst of it? He's just he's walking by, walking ahead of me. He's missing the fact that I'm here. Hey! When the disciples then scream out, Jesus, hey, help, he gets in the boat, and it becomes a moment. And the Gospels describe this moment. They didn't understand what had happened with the feeding of the 5,000. The other Gospel says that when they fed the 5,000 people, they were trying to make him king. Make him king. Da, 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 da. He's like Moses. He can feed thousands of people in the wilderness with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He can make manna appear from the sky. He's the bread king. Make him king. Make him king. Da, da. And Jesus says, look, they have no idea what I'm really about. They understand the idea of the Messiah. They don't you understand that I am the Son of God. And as he steps in the boat, the water goes calm. And the other gospel says, and they say, look, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Jesus wants us to understand that when fears are present, there is a greater presence. There's another force, like Hannah spoke about. Let's talk about a minute how Jesus faced fear. He starts his ministry off. He faces this idea of hunger, and he doesn't eat for 40 days and 40 nights. He fasts, and when he's at his weakest, that's when the devil comes to tempt him. He quotes scripture back at him and battles off the temptation in that moment. He healed lepers. He touched people who were sick. He raises Lazarus from death. He takes on the religious leaders of the day and holds the truth up to them when they're misunderstanding the story of God, when they're all stuck up in the law as a way of being saved and missed the gospel and missed the love of God, this audacious love that wanted to be their God and be with them and free them from fear. They missed that side of God, and so he confronts the religious leaders of his day who were the power people of his time in the land of Israel. He boldly speaks to the Roman official, Pilate, who has the authority to kill him. And he's not afraid. And then literally as he's hanging from the cross, he's not afraid of what's happening. He's not panicking. Instead he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. He says, make sure you take care of my mom. And then he says these incredible words. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. In those moments when we would literally be afraid, Jesus walks through these moments and he's not afraid. And with Jesus, he said, I want you to understand that I am with you in the midst of this life. I understand what the fears are like. I walked through them. I understand how it feels to be afraid. I understand what it's like when you're walking through these difficult challenges of life. I walk beside you, even on earth, through those times. And I came in the midst of them to speak peace, to defeat sin and death and the power of the devil. And at the cross and in the empty tomb, those things were erased, they were destroyed, and we live in a sense of freedom. We've got this forgiveness of God. I have a guaranteed future because of Jesus. I'm going to be with God in heaven. My sin's been erased. I'm not afraid of sin. I'm not afraid of dying. I will be with God here or with God in heaven. Either way, this God who absolutely loves me says he will be with me here until I'm with him there. And the cool news for us as Christian people, we actually get to choose the story of our lives. Make the own narrative of how our life will go. Is my life just a story about the moment, the fear that I'm facing, or this current moment of my life, or this current year? Is my life just about what I see and what I'm afraid of right now, or is there something bigger? Is there an upper story, a bigger story? The story of God at work carrying out his plan in the world. We would all say yes. Now, there is an upper story. There's God's big plan that's still happening in the midst of my life. And when I don't see it or feel it in my personal life today, it doesn't stop the fact that this story of God is still happening. Because in that upper story, the truth is God's in control. In that upper story, we all believe. We know that the truth is God keeps his promises. In that upper story, Jesus beat sin and death. In that upper story, we're going to go to heaven. We get this big story, but sometimes in the midst of these moments in our life, it's hard to believe. Fears are still real. So I met a little over a week ago with a young man, and I'll keep his name anonymous, but he's been in love with this girl and planning and growing in their faith, and they began talking about marriage and talking about the love that they had, and they'd been through a lot and worked through challenges together, and they got this cool place of having these great conversations about faith and challenging each other to love Jesus and follow Jesus, and he literally was planning to move down to where she's at so they could set up a home and get married. And she had just told him the Saturday before we got together that she was going to break it off. And he didn't see it coming. And he's heartbroken. And then the words of that song, is there life after love? This greatest fear, will I give my love to somebody and have it thrown back in my face? Will I really find someone who will just love me? And when moments like that happen, you sort of begin to question and doubt, is there really going to be love in my life? I literally talked to him the last night and asked if I could share that story. He said, sure. He goes, actually, I think God is showing me some things. He was trying to teach me through all that. And God still got this. He's still in control. I'm still sad. I still miss her. But I'm going to be okay. The God who was with me in establishing that relationship is the God who is still with me now, and I'm not afraid. Because when we're afraid, that's when we grab onto the things that we know are true. I may not feel it, but I'm going to grab onto things I believe are true about God, promises that he's made to me, things that say, don't be afraid. Well, you say, don't be afraid, God, but things are scary. He says, I'm telling you, I will be with you. Don't be afraid. And so in storms and in sadness and grief and in broken relationships and uncertainty and when our hearts are broken and when life is messy and life is hard, Jesus steps in and Jesus says, just like he did those guys in the water, it's I. Don't be afraid. See, part of this week was for me is I don't want to buy into the narrative that I should live in fear. I don't want us as a church to buy into the narrative that we should live in fear. We have a countercultural God who speaks a good news story into the moments of fear, a God of hope that says there is a promise to change things when you live in the gospel and that gospel impacts the world. When this audacious love I've given you comes out of you, it has the power to impact culture, to change lives. The Spirit of God is at work, and he has the power to bring faith and hope and the love of God into the lives of people through faith in Jesus. In the book written by Bob Goff called Love Does, in this particular section of the book, he tells a story. And he starts off with this phrase: go live a really, really full life, one that is chock full of adventures. Jesus said, go live a really, really full life, one that is chock full of adventures. And in the book, he tells a story of his son who has saved up his allowance, and he's going to buy a sailboat. And he found one on Craigslist. And he's thinking, here's my teenage son. Okay, this guy's is a scammer, going to take him for his money. So he goes down with this kid to see this boat. It's got four beds in it, Dad. It's a great deal. And when they get there thinking it's going to be a scam, actually it's this really cool guy, a really normal guy. He's a scientist. He's been studying cancer research and taking this boat all over for adventures. And what he really wanted to do is give this boat to some kid like his son who would take the boat on further adventures. So he gives his money, signs the deed, and takes the boat. And that boat then led to his son's couple of years of great adventures on this old sailboat that still was seaworthy. And they traveled and they went places on this boat and had great adventures. And the thought of the story comes back to us in this moment. What is your story? Because when they named the boat the story. because it already had a story from its previous owner and great adventures. And he would tell his own story of his own adventures, and he sold to somebody else who was going to take it and have more adventures with this boat. If you tell your story, are there any fears in your life that are preventing you from jumping into the life God is leading you to? Are there fears that keep you stuck at home when you really could be out loving people? Is there a sense of calling God's placed in your life, but you have this deep sense of fear that I don't know that I've got enough, or I'm enough, or I can actually do it, so you never actually take the step and try and go on the adventure? My challenge to all of us, me included this morning, is I think sometimes my own fears have kept me from the adventure. I literally had to wrestle when people asked me again about a month or so ago about this lead pastor thing. And my key question with God was, am I afraid to lead? Am I just wussing out? We have these gifts. We have this awesome group of people called Holy Cross. Am I just wimping out? Am I too afraid to lead? And I had to really wrestle with, am I afraid to lead that next adventure for us as a church? And I came to the conclusion, no, I love being here. I love being your pastor. I love the adventure that I think God's leading us on. And I want to be a part of that. I still know that my gifts are in the administrative leader role. And I'm okay with that statement to say we're going to take the life that God has given us, the passion that he has, and the calling he's placed on your life, and I'm going to jump in with both feet. Because then I will find that God uses me in ways I did not expect. Impacting the lives of people I did not expect. Having spiritual conversations about Jesus with people I did not expect. What will your story be? Will it be a story of fear and hiding back? Or you call your life, this is the story. This is my story and the part of God's upper story to save the planet. This is my story of Jesus impacting my life and God keeping his promises to me. This is the grace and love of God in the big story captured by my heart and my life, impacting the people around me. Is your life going to be a story of fears or an adventure? Paul writes these words, and I want to close with this. He's imprisoned, and he writes to the Philippian church, "Pray for me also, that when I speak, words may be given me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I'm an ambassador in chains. I pray that I may declare it fearlessly as I should." My prayer as your pastor is that those words would be yours. God, whenever I speak, in the way that I live, I want to live fearlessly. I want to fearlessly make known the gospel. I want to be on this grand adventure, God, this plan of yours to save human beings from hell, to give them hope, to say there is a God who is with you in the midst of your deepest fears, in the midst of your deepest pains. I know of a God who comes alongside in the midst of the storms of life and says, I am with you, don't be afraid. And that Jesus you have come to know and believe in, that Jesus who's about to say, and when I died for you. This is my body and blood given and shed for you. The grace and forgiveness of God, it is personal. It touches you. Don't be afraid. And that's not a general phrase to the world. Today, Jesus says, this is my body and blood for you. You are forgiven. You are destined for heaven. You are precious and beloved by God. Don't be afraid. I am with you. I am for you. And I am in you. Will the story of your life be a story of fear or an incredible adventure of sharing the gospel? Our prayer for each other is that as a church and as individual people, that's my life. I want it to be an adventure of fearlessly sharing the gospel of Jesus, because it so changed me. If that spoke to you or you agree with that, honk your horn and say amen.